Welcome to the Art of Skill podcast, episode 1. Hey, that's me. I'm your host, Rick Ellis. Today's guest is Robb Wolf, best-selling author, nutrition expert, scientist, elite athlete, strength coach, BJJ brown belt, and entrepreneur. Stay tuned. You don't want to miss this one. The Art of Skill podcast is brought to you by Element Electrolyte Drink Mix. If you're an athlete, you need to be paying attention to your electrolytes for optimum health, performance, and recovery. Element comes in a variety of great flavors. Each packet contains sodium, potassium, magnesium, and no sugar or artificial junk. Just add a packet of Element to your water bottle and you're good to go. We have an exclusive offer for fans of the Art of Skill podcast. Get a sample pack mailed to you for the price of shipping. For more information, visit drinkelement.com/theartofskill. That's drinklmnt.com/theartofskill. Stay salty, my friends. Robb Wolf is in the house. Hey, Robb.
Rick, good to see you. What's new?
I am so thrilled that you are guest number 1 on episode 1 of the Art of Skill podcast. Treading dangerously. I can't guarantee I'm not going to crash this thing on the rocks.
Usually people go to me as a guest when they want their career to end. And so we may get this all, it may be like a hat trick deal where you start and end your career all in one shot. So yeah.
If you have an ounce of self-preservation, just push me off the deck and grab the helm.
Perfect.
Good to see you, my friend.
Good to see you.
Let's get some housekeeping done and let's introduce Robb Wolf. For those of you who don't know who Robb Wolf is, for those 2 of you in the entire world, one who has been living in the bush in Alaska for the last 20 years and the other who just emerged from a cave in Afghanistan, Robb Wolf is a 2-time New York Times and Wall Street Journal best-selling author of The Paleo Solution and Wired to Eat, both excellent books which I've read and I recommend to people. He's a former research biochemist who has leveraged his experience as a scientist into becoming one of the world's leading experts in Paleolithic nutrition. He was the executive producer of the film Sacred Cow, which was also excellent. Robb is a former California State powerlifting champion with some pretty impressive numbers, a 6-0 amateur kickboxer, and he currently holds the rank of brown belt in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. Now you're talking my language. Robb is the founder of the Healthy Rebellion, an online community dedicated to helping people reach their health and fitness goals. Robb has functioned as a review editor for the Journal of Nutrition and Metabolism and as a consultant for the Naval Special Warfare Resiliency Program. And just to add insult to injury, Robb took down a 650-pound elk with an atlatl, which is a hand-thrown spear, on Discovery Channel's I Caveman series. In a former life, Robb founded the very first CrossFit affiliate, that's pretty cool, and later the 4th CrossFit. As a highly respected strength and conditioning coach, he was named by Men's Health magazine as having one of the top facilities in the United States. And more recently, Robb has founded a company called Elemental Labs, which has a very cool nutritional product that I'm excited to talk to him about. That's a good resume, Robb.
I should be taller than 5'9" with a resume like that, but I'm not. So I do what I can with it.
Are you an overachiever? I've always been a little OCD, and I have to have some project that I'm working on at all times. Are you that way?
I guess I kind of am. Like the other day, we have some house guests, and which is great, but like my usual, kind of workflow kind of got interrupted, and I was just kind of sitting there like, okay, so what am I doing? Because my father-in-law is converting a 3rd bay of our garage into a proper office, and then my wife can have an office, I can have an office. So I couldn't really work out. I had to be close because the kids were waking up and I had to fix breakfast, but I was just in this kind of fidgety mode where I didn't have anything specifically that I could or should be doing. and it was a little disconcerting. I did a meditation, and like I was like, well, I'll do my meditation that I need to do, and so I did that. But even that was doing something, and so I guess a little bit, but I've never really seen myself like that. I definitely I do the things that I really enjoy doing reasonably well, and if I don't like it, I can't be troubled to do it at all, even if it will save my life. So it's I have a very narrow beam on I guess the neurotic things that I follow.
Yeah, I can relate to that. The things that I'm into, I'm really into. The things that I'm not into at all, much to my detriment.
Yeah.
So Rob, the pressing question I have, so you and I met like 15 years ago.
Yeah.
I think it was like 2006 or thereabouts.
Yep.
And as I'm looking at you here, I'm wondering, what in the world does your skincare routine consist of? Because you have not aged a day.
Thank you for noticing. Maybe your eyes are just failing at such a rapid rate that I'm getting this Sybil Shepherd soft focus kind of effect there. So yeah. I eat a pretty low carb diet. I actually get a lot of sun, but I manage it pretty closely. I don't burn, but I use this little app and have for, 5 years, 6 years, called D-Minder. And it basically, you put in your relative skin type. It will geolocate to where you are. And then it basically will give you a pretty good approximation of maximum time in the sun to get the most vitamin D but cause the least amount of skin damage. Because actually, if you start tanning very much, then you're causing some skin damage, and then you need to go back and get even more time in the sun to get the same amount of vitamin D. But that eating pretty low carb, getting good sleep, those things I think are as consistent with an anti-aging strategy as what one could find. And even saying that, though, somebody who has really outstanding glycemic response, like their body, someone like my wife can eat a fairly carb-rich meal, and her blood sugar will look like what my blood sugar looks like eating a low-carb meal. So there's very little peaks and troughs to the blood sugar response. Whereas if I were to eat the carb-rich meal that she eats, I would get like these super highs and these super lows, which is not particularly good for, aging, whether it's our brain or our skin or anything else.
So I lived in Cancun for 3 years. I lived in Acapulco for a while. These are long stories, which we won't get into today, but and we lived in Hawaii for a while, and I have spent way, way too much time in the sun, and I have sun damage, and so I probably shouldn't be in the sun too much as I need that vitamin D.
Right.
But you look good, man.
Thank you.
You look good. Do you remember? Are you from California? Did you grow up there?
I like to call it the state of Jefferson because it's far, far north, and if that area could break away, it would. But yes, from the Redding, Chico, Red Bluff area originally. So
I grew up in Southern California in Orange County. Do you remember when we were young, the California raisin commercials?
Oh, yeah.
That were kind of everywhere. Yeah. So this was a long-running ad campaign, the California Raisin Board. They created these characters that were, they're like Mr. Potato Heads, but they were raisins with little stubby arms. And the funny thing is, when that ad campaign came out, one of those characters looked exactly like my father. I mean, just uncanny. It looked like my father. And years later, when I met my then girlfriend, now wife, I showed her a picture. I'm like, who does this look like? And she's like, oh my God, that's your father. And so
that's amazing.
My greatest fear in life, because I don't really look a lot like my father, but as I'm getting older, I'm seeing little glimpses into my father.
Right.
My greatest fear in life is that I'm headed for California raisin territory.
Right,
so
right.
Whatever you're doing, I'm on. So do you do some of that anti-aging stuff? There was a researcher who was on Joe Rogan. I forget his name, and they do research on rats, on all living organisms, on bacteria, on yeast, and they have found that they can extend the life of all of this stuff by at least 5%, in some cases much more, through intermittent fasting, through caloric deprivation. There's a compound called NMN. There's something called, there's resveratrol, of course, and there's something called metformin. And do you follow that stuff? Are you into that sort of stuff?
I mean, I follow it, but it's funny. I'm really critical of the standard trope that is kind of brought out in the anti-aging realm. My usually each year I do kind of a big thematic talk that I'll go on the road and give these talks at like the Metabolic Health Summit and Ancestral Health Society and whatnot. And my 2020 talk was longevity. Are we trying too hard? And I gave it a one public presentation in January, just as we heard about this kind of wacky emerging virus out of China, and then the world got shut down, and I didn't really get to give the talk after that. But I'm really critical and suspicious as time goes on of the research looking at animal models as it relates to longevity. Brett Weinstein has made the case that lab animals have been bred in a lab environment long enough to have adapted to that situation in kind of interesting, unique ways. Their telomeres have elongated, and telomeres are an important part of the packaging that keeps our DNA woven properly together. And so he thinks that a ton of what we see on drug trials, and I think the supposed benefits of calorie restriction are actually an artifact of looking at this in the equivalent of 100,000 years of human evolution, but done in animals in a lab setting. So I think it's almost entirely an artifact of the way that they've set these things up. When you take wild type animals collected from the wild, put them in a calorie restricted setting, they die early. And you don't see any of the longevity benefits and whatnot. I also think another piece to this is, without a doubt, overeating is very antagonistic to longevity and health. Like, there's just no two ways about that. But once you, and this is no small thing, like living in a modern world of hyper-palatable foods and messaging around food and everything, it's a non-trivial thing to figure out how to navigate the world without overtly overeating. But once someone is not wantonly overeating and they get adequate protein and they get some exercise and maybe they get some appropriate sunlight on their skin, I don't know how much more upside there is to fasting and intermittent fasting and things like that. Like, doing a little bit here and there is great. I don't think humans are definitely not grazing animals, but I also don't know that, particularly as we age, that lots and lots of fasting is a really good thing. The thought with this fasting and calorie restriction and all this type of stuff is it's going to reduce our likelihood of cardiovascular disease, cancer, and neurodegenerative disease. And again, once people are just simply not overeating and you're not a smoker, your likelihood of all those things just fall off a cliff. Like, it just plummets. It's not zero, but it's also not one. It's not a guarantee. Whereas all of us, if we live long enough, we will all face age-related sarcopenia, this loss of muscle mass as we age. That is a guarantee. And I'm really nervous about these folks that are afraid of protein and they're skipping meals and they're doing 72, 3-day, 5-day, 10-day fasts. And they're in their late 40s and 50s in this period of time where you can be capping off the muscle that you're going to need if you're going to live to be 80 or 90. And I'm really nervous about folks. I'm nervous about what the long-term, consequences of that are going to be. And a good number of my friends, some very smart tech mogul folks, very similar to yourself, they had gotten pretty far down the rabbit hole of fasting. And these folks looked like hell, like dark circles under their eyes. They didn't look like they could protect themselves in a fight. If their car slid off of an icy road and went down an embankment, I couldn't imagine them clawing their way to the top of the road and hiking several miles to save their own skin, to say nothing of their families. And so I really kind of admonish these folks, like, hey, get at least 2 meals a day, maybe something crazy like 3. Make sure it's got a decent size whack of protein every meal. And once a month, do a 3-day fast or a 2-day fast. And in the eating window, try to make it between 9 a.m. and 4 p.m. or 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. Like, it doesn't need to be anything crazy. to a person, these folks, like their skin looked better, the dark circles under their eyes went away. They put on 5 or 8 pounds of muscle and started getting some PRs in the gym, which I like that performance marker. Like we can't always be generating personal records in the gym with lifts or, doing something on the Airdyne or what have you, but you can also get to a pretty good spot and then just maintain. And if we are seeing retrograde performance, if you used to have 20 dead hang pull-ups and now you have 8, that's a problem. That's a major problem. Either you gained a lot of weight or you lost a lot of muscle and strength. And so that was like a super long, rambling answer to your very concise question. But, I follow the longevity research, but I'm in a minority, pretty vocal minority that I think that these very smart people have really missed the boat on the vast majority of that stuff. Yeah.
Your response actually surprises me a little bit because coming from the world of CrossFit and all that sort of thing, intermittent fasting is a thing. I intermittently fast mostly because I'm lazy and it just lets me not have to eat in the mornings. I just drink some coffee, I get to work, I do my thing, and then I'll glance up at 1 o'clock in the afternoon and I'm like, I should probably get a meal. And then I'll eat my, I sort of consider the first meal of the day sort of dinner in a way, like I try to tank up. And then I teach Jiu Jitsu later in the afternoon, the evening, and then I'll eat again when I get home. So I'm kind of a 2 meal a day, maybe with a snack in there, maybe sometimes a protein shake or something in there. And that's kind of my pattern, but I do them, mostly because it sort of lets me be a little lazy. It turns off some of those hunger triggers. It's interesting to hear you say that you're a little skeptical about the aging benefits of that sort of thing.
Yeah, I wrote my first article on intermittent fasting and the potential of improved health and longevity in 2005, and it was released mainly to a CrossFit crowd. And by 2006, I deeply regretted releasing this thing mainly because the folks who do CrossFit, they're so over the top, type A. So I would get these reports from people, and they're like, whether they were male or female, they're like, I have no libido, my hair is falling out, I'm cold even on summer days, and I'm like, okay, so what have you been doing? It's like, well, I CrossFit 6 days a week. On my day off, I do hot yoga with a 40-mile ruck march, wearing a 50-pound vest. And I intermittent fast 22 hours a day. I ate 5 grams of carbs the last month. And they take everything that is good and then put it on steroids and then stack it all together. So like a little bit of intermittent fasting is great. Probably a little bit of protein cycling is great. Some high intensity interval training is great. But when you start stacking one upon the other, all of these things are stressors. And we need some stress, but we need appropriate doses of stress. And within that CrossFit crowd, I think there's a tendency, people will see someone go from 300 pounds to 150 pounds doing a low carb diet, but you've got this CrossFit Games hopeful athlete who just wants to go from 8% body fat to 6% body fat, which from a performance standpoint, there's absolutely nothing that suggests it's going to improve the performance and will actually degrade the performance for that person. They just want to look super impressive and jacked, which is fine, but it may be really antagonistic to their health. But a super low carb diet may not be the proper intervention for this person who's doing twice a day training, and they're just wanting to go from elite level leanness to holy smokes elite level leanness, so just misapplication of these different tools. All of them are valuable, but they're very context driven.
When I was preparing for my black belt exam, I went on a pretty intense workout program. I was doing 2 a day, and I scaled my eating way up. I was eating like an animal, and I was continuing to lose weight despite the fact that I was just tanking up all the time. So I don't know how these people do it, where they're just so calorie deprived and they're hammering so hard, because I think it's the opposite. You need to fuel yourself.
Yeah, well, and this is why they end up destroying their endocrine system, and they have no libido, and their hair falls out even more rapidly than what you and I have. So
mine started falling out at age 38, so I'm, That's how it
And
goes.
I keep joking, I'm not actually losing my hair. It's just a relocation program. It's all moving to my back. So yeah. So I think net, I haven't actually lost any hair. It's just
as you get older, you're
location.
like, I've got hair coming out my ears. What is going on here? Like you start finding hairs in places where it's just a cruel.
Yeah, you
joke,
have to really
man.
take personal grooming to a different level to stay on top of that stuff. For
That's
sure.
right. My wife has always reminded me. She's like, you've got a wild hair coming out of your head or whatever. So. I want to get back to all this nutrition stuff, especially maybe as it relates to the older athlete. For better or worse, this channel seems to be attracting a bit of an older crowd. And my wife tells me to embrace it. She's like, bro, look at yourself in the mirror. Have you seen yourself lately? You're old, So I want to circle back to that, but let's talk a little bit about jiu-jitsu. So you and I trained jiu-jitsu. We have rolled one time back in like 2006. Mm-hmm. You had done a little bit of training. If memory serves, it was at the Gracie Academy, I believe, or somewhere like that.
Yeah, it's funny. A good friend of mine, haven't seen him in a good long time, but Paul Hoke, he had a gym down in Long Beach, California called Long Beach Martial Arts Academy. And it was kind of like JKD, some Kali, some Eskrima, some Thai boxing. And then this Brazilian guy came in, and he was then a purple belt within the Gracie scene. And I think it was UFC 2. He was in the crowd bringing Royce out to the octagon. But that was my first exposure to jiu-jitsu, and I had just enough high school wrestling so that I did absolutely ridiculous stuff and got murdered. I think even worse than what somebody who had no grappling experience seemingly, and it was a huge eye-opener. It was a similar eye-opener to when I had a brown belt in the Parker style of Kempo karate and went to Long Beach and sparred with a kid who'd been doing Thai boxing for 6 months, and he just annihilated me, destroyed me, and the kid was smaller, not as strong, not as explosive, and just this actual Matt Thornton talks about the delivery system, that Thai boxing, Greco, jiu-jitsu, they're just amazing delivery systems for really figuring this stuff out. So I had a little bit of training. I got down to the Torrance Academy and did like a week or two, but I was in this kind of weird spot where I really was intrigued by the jiu-jitsu, but I was very close to getting my Thai boxing instructor certification. So I really had to focus on that. And so I didn't really see any more hands-on jiu-jitsu instruction until 2004 when John Frankel moved to Chico, California, and we opened NorCal Martial Arts, CrossFit NorCal. But I was running a capoeira group at that time and the CrossFit group. So I got 2 or 3 classes with John, but I was just so busy. I had no real opportunity to train. And then John left after about 6 months because he got a professorship in Korea. And so he kind of started that whole chunk of his life. So, I went from like 1993 with about a week of instruction till 2004 with, a week or 2 of instruction. And then I think we got up and did a day or 2 up with Roy and got to hang out with you guys a bit. But it wasn't until 2012 that I really was able to carve out this, okay, here's my schedule. This is, I think jiu-jitsu schools finally got established enough that there were noon classes consistently and some things like that because of my early wake up and all that stuff. Like the evening classes just never worked for me. I'd be awake until 1 o'clock and then, couldn't fall asleep. And when I had to get up at, 5 in the morning, it was just murdering me. So it was a long process. Technically, I've been doing jiu-jitsu since 1993. So I should be one of the oldest, deepest black belts out there ever known. Technically, I've been doing jiu-jitsu longer than just about anyone I meet. Yeah. But there's some caveats to that. Yeah.
Yeah. You could be you could be one of the dirty dozen, right?
Yeah,
the 12 American non-Brazilians to receive their black belt. So tell me about your journey. Right. Every belt means something different, especially from the eyes of the person doing jiu-jitsu. The way that you perceive your white belt journey becomes very different at blue belt, becomes different at purple, and now you're a brown belt, which is a pretty good place to be. Brown belt to me is it's the black belt without the pressure. in a way.
Right.
You know? It's,
right.
it's like you have the prestige of it, but there's not quite that expectation that you got to be able to take care of business, you know?
Right.
So from your perspective, how is the journey through your eyes? What has the journey been like?
You know, it's definitely been interesting. So this is maybe kind of an interesting aside too, but so I found Matt Thornton's, the SBG founder, I found his website back in 1998. And I was just kind of casting around for both jiu-jitsu information, but also some nutrition related stuff. And Matt had done this deep dive into kind of the zone diet, which is very friendly to all this paleo, low carb type stuff. A little different angle on it, but Matt's been writing and blogging for a long time. And so I found Matt's stuff, and he really talked about aliveness. And this was still at a time when the discussions around like traditional martial, you know, could a karate guy beat a boxer, you know, and all this type of stuff. You know, the UFC had kind of answered some of that stuff, but not really. Like, I think there was still kind of some mass neuroses around a lot of those topics. And so I found Matt's work early on, and the SPG concept got on my radar. And then people like Roy, and, you know, ended up meeting them and really grafted onto this fundamentals approach to doing whatever it is you're doing. You know, like as you know, like Roy's jiu-jitsu is beautiful and wonderful, but it's pretty direct. There's not like these 18-step processes to things. It's like most attacks are one move or two moves. If you're getting really fancy, there might be a 3, you know, thing set up to it. But I got exposed to enough good coaching early that it was kind of funny. I didn't know that much jiu-jitsu, but I knew what good coaching was.
Yeah. Well, you had been a strength and conditioning coach.
Yeah. I had a decent movement background.
And an athlete at a high level. You knew what good coaching was.
Yeah. And all the props to the folks that I was able to do some training with early on, but the people that I initially was able to do some jiu-jitsu with, it was these kind of long scripted movement pattern things. And like, I just couldn't get it. Like I just couldn't make that stuff work, you know, and I had a little brushing with some of the SPG, you know, methodology, and doing some training with Roy where you introduce something, then you do a lot of positional drilling and sparring to like solidify that and get some riffing, because like if you're wanting to work half guard bottom, maybe you end up there a lot in rolling, or maybe you end up there like once a month. And so if you want to improve that spot, you've got to actually do some like focused training on there. And the folks that I trained with early on really came out of some different lineages that were kind of these people seemed to have like almost encyclopedic memories for movement. So like they could string together these like super complex movements, and you know, and I just couldn't do that. And so my first, you know, my blue belt to purple belt, it was cool. One, like my white belt, by the time I finally got my blue belt, was just tattered. Like it was ancient, because I got it from John Ogden, who was a judo luminary way back in the day down in Southern California. So I was wearing a judo gi with a judo white belt, you know, and that's what carried me through to getting my blue belt. And then a similar process happened. Like I had my blue belt for ages. Like it was periwinkle by the time I you know, got out of blue belt, but it was tough because I kind of knew that there was a different way of doing these things. And I knew that I responded better to this kind of like I-method type approach, where you do some very low resistance, perfect the movement, and now start riffing on it, you know, positionally and you know, creating a little game around it. It's like, okay, you're going to pass guard, and, you know, Rick's gonna keep you in his close guard. And here are the 3 tools you both have to deal with this, so that we just really focused on that stuff and explored it. And then, okay, now I'm going to rotate to a different body and a different body, because a tall guy, short guy, a female, all this stuff is going to be different energy. And we would really riff on that. And I really do well with that stuff. And it was right around blue heading to purple that Henry Aiken released his online material, and I started going to his seminars, and I was able to kind of sneak, and then also using Roy's material, looking at a lot of Roy's stuff. Henry's stuff was interesting, though, in that he actually broke down, he would introduce a situation, but then he also broke down how to positionally spar that with people, which was kind of a next additional thing that I think was really valuable, particularly for somebody that was going to class, but really trying to not do what the class curriculum was, So it gave me some context for how to kind of weave that stuff together. And then it was around that purple belt range that Ray Price, who's a black belt within SBG, he reopened a school in Reno, Nevada, and that's where my training started finally getting much more consistent. And then right on the heels of that, we had maybe a year and a half of consistent training. And then we moved to Texas, and we helped my friend Michael Hines open Straight Blast Gym, Texas there. But there was probably a year where Nikki and I did a little training together, but there may be 2 training sessions during that time. And then Michael opened his gym, started getting that going, and then COVID hit. So within that, there was basically a 2-year period where my training was really, really skinny, but still somehow managed to do enough training that John Frankel was insightful enough or foolish enough to give me a brown belt. And that kind of brings me up to today. And now we live in Kalispell, Montana, and there are 3 Straight Blast Gym affiliates within a 30-minute drive of my house, which is really cool. And each one of the schools is pretty robust in the depth of bench, both for the kids programs, but also for the adult programs. Like, there are a lot of good folks in there, beginners as well as more advanced people. The other day, I think we had 5 black belts at the noon class and maybe 8 or 10 brown belts, God knows how many, like blue belts and everything. So it's really cool. Like, there's a lot of bodies to work with. If you're wanting to do a really mellow technical roll that day, then you've got that. If you want somebody who, you want to get your mundial, feel on, then you've got somebody who can accommodate that too. So yeah, that's kind of, I guess, a big walk through it.
That's an ideal situation. When you train with people who you're better than, it's dynamic drilling. You can, and I always tell people, have a goal when you show up to roll. Have something that you're working on. You mentioned half guard. Put yourself in half guard repeatedly. Figure out how to work yourself to half guard against resistance. So you're going against someone who's a white belt, blue belt, or whatever, and just use those opportunities to start dynamically drilling at resistance, the things that you're trying to work on. And then you get those better guys where it can be more technical. It can be, move, counter move. Or there's those guys that are better than you that are just going to smash you, and you get to work on your defense, And you mentioned, Roy has always been known for having just a beautiful, elegant, fluid game, but it's very fundamentally sound. He doesn't play a lot of crazy, he doesn't invert a lot. He doesn't do a lot of the stuff that you would think that a guy with his athleticism would be drawn to. It's all very fundamental. And I trained at a competition-oriented school, and you're absolutely right. It was very methodical in, okay, you start with your grip here, then we have to do a grip switch here, and now you have to pull the knee across and control it here, and then your hand goes to the hip, and then this, and then, and there's like 15 moves to get from here to there, and I've never been able to assimilate that either. I mean, I can flow chart it, I can see the various positions and work my way there, but I don't see this complex, and maybe in the competition game where it's really about these incremental improvements of position that you have to maintain against somebody who's going to fight you 100%. I can see some value in that, but that's not how I play, and it sounds like that's not how you play.
Yeah, like I just can't. I don't really learn that way. Like, if you give me some general concepts, base and posture, connecting on your terms, not connecting on their terms, things like that. And then, of course, there's always a technical, story to be told. John Frankel is staying with us right now. And just in passing, I mentioned, oh, this guy's got this kind of leg weave that he does when he's trying to pass my guard. And it's a handful to deal with. And John showed me this just ridiculously simple way to address that. Grab the back of their tricep, kick your leg straight, and then you're like in this omoplata, position and everything. I'm like, oh my God. And,
isn't that funny?
I don't think it was John that coined this, but somebody said, everything in jiu-jitsu is obvious once you see it,
Yeah.
But then it's just hidden.
It's simultaneously amazing and annoying that you'll train for a long, long time. And one day you see something and it's literally been there your whole life. And it's the simplest thing. You're like, oh,
it's hidden in plain sight. Yeah.
Yeah, very much so. So you're a little older guy, not as old as me, but you're getting a little older and you are very fit. How do you think is the best way to stay in shape for something like jiu-jitsu? What does your training look like and what do you recommend? I know you don't really coach people strength and conditioning anymore that much, but probably a lot of people pick your brain on this kind of stuff.
I think as time goes on, mobility work becomes ever more important, just kind of joint integrity and maintaining the ability to do good movement. And I've really, the past couple of years, gotten into this FRC, functional range conditioning, kin stretch. It's a movement modality developed by a jiu-jitsu black belt, Dr. Andrea Ospina. And he's a doctor of physical therapy also. Yeah, he's an amazing guy. And what it looks at, so like everybody loves, we love pressing and we love pulling these big macro movements, but there are all these situations, whether we're externally rotated, internally rotated, that these are the spots where we get injured. It's at the end range of joint activity. Mm-hmm. And they tackle both the mobility elements, so like I'm going external rotation here, and that's as much as I can actively do it. But if I assist it, I can push it more. So I've got a deficit between what I can do passively and what I can do actively. And ideally, they're the same. Ideally, I could push this back with my other hand, or somebody could push it back, and I could also do it, under muscular load, and they would.
So there's a muscular deficiency there.
Kind of a muscular deficiency between active and passive, activity in this range and in this range. So they work to address that, but you will do kind of loaded isometrics in these end range positions. And like you pop a diamond out of your pants when you do this stuff. Like it's like doing a max effort deadlift or what have you. And they tackle all the joints, the knees, the hips, and they provide a way to assess where you are, but then also a way to scale it for where you are in that process. Part of their assessment, within CrossFit, it's like, okay, the workout of the day is push press and box jumps. Okay, well, what if, and it's really interesting, Andrea Ospina, in CrossFit land, they would just say, well, if your shoulder is hurt, we'll use a PVC pipe or something and just load it minimally. And Andrea Ospina would say, no, we're not going to go overhead at all because you don't actually have a shoulder. And he will define a shoulder by these very specific criteria. And it's like, okay, you've got a joint, you've got this and you've got that, but you don't technically have a shoulder because you don't have a ball and socket joint that exists between this range and this range. So you've got something, but I'm not going to call it a shoulder yet. When we get it rehabbed to a point where you can do X, Y, Z, now you have a shoulder. But if you don't have a shoulder, you don't press overhead. We modify your movement so you're pressing in kind of a horizontal angle or something like that. And so I think that's a
tough sell.
Work,
that is a tough sell to athletes. We're not going to press even though you're hurt.
Well, you're going to press, but you're going to press in a range that makes sense for you. So like if the workout calls for overhead pressing, but you don't technically have an overhead position, then we might stick you on an incline bench and you're going to do kind of incline bench pressing or something like that. But we're not just going to arbitrarily make you press overhead because that's what the workout calls for. And so you would do your pressing movements, and then in between those, you're doing some functional range conditioning so that we improve that range of movement so that you can actually do some overhead pressing. But it is a gut check because virtually nobody walks in there, whether they're a dancer or a martial artist or what have you, and they're not, deficient in some way. But this is kind of the benefit of doing something like this stuff. But I think as folks get a little older, the mobility is really important, and things like yoga and basic stretching are good. But man, I'm a huge fan of this FRC kin stretch stuff, and there are some great.
Can you do it online? Is it an online thing?
Hunter Cook has a great online program. It's called Hunter Fitness. I have some dear friends, Basis Health and Performance, Sarah and Grayson Strange. They have a phenomenal online program, and there's different levels of buy-in. It's kind of like, here's your prepackaged program. Here's like some amount of individualized coaching where they'll look at some video of you doing some movement. I mean, it to me, it's very affordable. And if you are investing any amount of time or effort into jiu-jitsu when you're past the age of 40, like I can't think of a better investment than that stuff. And above and beyond that, I like to see people do resistance training at least 2 days a week. And that can be dependent. Like if you're still rolling 5 days a week, 2 days a week of strength training is liable to be a lot. And it may be some very low volume, more neurological based stuff, reasonably heavy, but low reps and non-fatiguing, a little bit of low intensity cardio to just aid with recovery, something like a Schwinn Airdyne or walking with a weighted vest or something. I think that stuff is really good. CrossFit is awesome in the way that it changed the perspective of the world, but it's been terrible, in my opinion, in that now everybody thinks that everything needs to be this like white buffalo in the sky near-death experience, and that low-level cardio where you can just breathe through your nose and use that as a recovery aid to kind of stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system and kind of take you out of warp drive, so incredibly valuable. So I think as we get older, that mobility work and joint integrity becomes ever more important. Still doing some amount of muscle maintenance, strength maintenance work as we age. And that would be my prescription for anybody. Like, again, as we get older, we have a tendency to lose muscle mass and power production as we age. But you can really push that out. Like a 90-year-old individual who strength trains can be as physically fit as a 50-year-old who is, healthy but otherwise sedentary. So that, in my mind, is where you get your lifespan enhancement. It's really your health span. Like you get a twice as long life of physical activity if we can play our cards right and be smart.
It's like changing the aging curve from being a slow descent into oblivion to you're up here
really
and then
and
then you drop off.
You get a 2-week decline and it sucks, but it's a lot better than a 20-year decline, which is what I saw my parents do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. Man, I could talk to you about this fitness stuff for a long time, but I know we have limited time today. So let's switch back to nutrition here.
Sure.
Paleo is kind of a loaded word. At least it used to be. Maybe it's not as bad as it used to be. You can find paleo stuff in boxes at the grocery store. But back in the mid-2000s when I first discovered it, was like, what is that weird caveman thing you're doing, right? And I think people, in their mind, they overcomplicate it, right? Oh, I've got to get rid of all this stuff in my diet, when really it's about, okay, we're limiting the grains or eliminating in some cases, maybe some legumes, keeping your fat intake high, there's just some basic stuff. How do you define paleo, and what do you generally recommend to people? You have this elimination period in your books that you talk about. So someone comes to you and they say, look, I want to get my diet rocking. How do you walk people through that?
Yeah, conceptually now I try to couch it all under ancestral health. So it's informed by evolutionary biology and kind of looking at both remote ancestors and more recent ancestors, and just kind of providing a hat tip that people who, huge variety of diets, but it's really hard to find a dietary approach that is worse than what modern westernized cultures have,
I love that term
somewhere-
you use. I love that term that you use a lot, hyper palatability. And you look at the ingredients on stuff and you're like, man, this was designed by a chemist. There's absolutely no way that this was a chef. This was a chemist that built this.
Yeah.
And they're trying to make people addicted to this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the same type of research goes into making food addictable as goes into social media and video games to spin that dopamine response and keep you continually going back and engaged. And they're very similar mechanism, and we see kind of similar results where it's very easy to get kind of stuck in that. And just as an aside, somewhere around 2005, 2007, a really interesting transition happened in the world. And for the first time in history, more people started dying from chronic degenerative disease than from infectious disease and malnutrition. And this is the first time in human history. Human history has been defined by malnutrition, infectious disease, injury, all that type of stuff. But somewhere around 2005, 2007, more people began dying due to overconsumption of food than underconsumption of food. And it's an interesting kind of demarcation. And so I use this ancestral template as kind of a place to go. And it goes much deeper than just diet. It deals with sleep and circadian rhythm, the gut microbiome, community. We are communal animals, and having adequate community is a critical feature of our health and wellness. And I think that this is part of the reason why things like Jiu Jitsu and CrossFit are so valuable to people, because you get that physical movement part, you get kind of a cognitive challenge part, and then you also get community. You're around a bunch of people that, although they try to choke you, they also care about you, So there's this, multi-pronged approach to that. But the way that I approach like a nutritional intervention at this point, first, what is the person's goals? With absent goals, this stuff generally has almost no meaning because we can drive the boat in a lot of different directions. But that said, generally just focusing on a protein-centric nutrition, making sure that the person gets about a gram of protein per pound of body weight. Can be a little bit, 10-20% less, 10-20% more, but that's a really good place to start. And if the person is significantly overweight, then maybe it's a gram of protein per pound of ideal body weight or something like that. But it's an easy benchmark to get things going. And then from there, some people run really well, kind of more fat fueled. Like I definitely am in that camp. Some people do better carb fueled. So it look, yeah. And then some people are kind of mixed, like they, kind of a zone, balanced fat carb ratio. So the next thing that I do is have the person do some tinkering and really just kind of ask themselves, when you eat a meal, can you go 6, 10, 8 hours without eating? And it's not to say that you want to do this all the time, but could you do that and do a jiu-jitsu session and do a long hike or something? And you might be hungry, but you're still functional. You're not like melting down, foggy-headed, hypoglycemic. And if you are okay with that, then whatever you're doing is working. If you're having some problems, usually it means that the person is eating either too many carbs or too refined of carbs. So they're tending to get in these kind of blood sugar roller coasters. They're not really able to access body fat for energy. So I try to figure out what the appropriate glycemic load is for the person. And it varies massively from person to person, situation to situation. But we start with the protein, figure out what amounts and types of carbohydrates or fats the person does well with. And then kind of the cherry on the sundae is taken more out of that classic paleo diet perspective. Does the person have any problems with specific foods? Do they react to gluten? Do they react to dairy? Do they have like really gnarly gas and bloating from things like legumes or onions? Like they react to these FODMAPs, these fermentable carbohydrates. Or I've met so many people that when I ask them, how's your digestion? They're like, great. And then you're doing a session with them and they're like farting and you can hear their stomach gurgling and everything. It's like, dude, do you have like a family of gerbils living in there? Like, oh, it's always been this way since I was a kid. And it's like, well, you've been eating something since you were a kid that's not sitting well with you, And so we do an elimination diet. Like, oh my God, I have no gas and bloating. Like my poop is normal now. And so this is the next final cherry on the sundae kind of finisher. Like I have celiac disease, so I'm very reactive to gluten. Not everybody is, but I'm surprised by how many people seem to have some degree of problems with gluten sensitivity, and that itself will even change. Folks will notice that if they're not training super hard and their sleep is good, they handle gluten just fine, but they start pushing really hard. Say they start training for like a black belt test or like Pan Ams or Mundials or something like that, and they start noticing all these kind of weird GI symptoms. And they're like, oh, if I switch to rice instead of wheat bread, my GI problems go away. So even things that you aren't really reactive to under low stress environments, you can become reactive to under higher stress environments. So this is where there becomes a lot of tweaking and nuance and detail. And the bugger for me is when these ideas like gluten sensitivity and paleo and all that, you want to keep it fairly simple. And so you have these kind of almost biblical type stories, 10 commandments come down off the mountainside and everything. It's like, this is pretty good lane lines. But then what people do with this nutrition is they literally do carve it into stone, turn it into religious doctrine. And then it's like, well, Rick isn't gluten reactive, so maybe that's not as big a deal, but he is carb reactive. So he should probably limit gluten containing items, not because of the immunogenic side of it, but just because it screws with his blood sugar, Right. But then people will be like, no, gluten damages everybody, and I do think it bothers more people than what most folks are aware of. But this is the challenge of allowing things to be customizable for the individual while also keeping a simple story that, the unwashed masses, can find something that they can start implementing and moving towards a healthier, diet and lifestyle.
I assume a big part of your gig is deprogramming people from food myths. My running, theory is you just wait 15 years and whatever you learned about nutrition is going to be wrong, and we have these persistent food myths, right? Fat causes fat, and this whole low fat revolution, which has been just horribly destructive to people, that salt is bad for you, that eggs cause cholesterol, like eating something with cholesterol causes cholesterol, even something like nitrates, they've been pretty maligned, and maybe it's not as bad as we thought. So what are some of those food myths that you encounter and maybe help deprogram us a little bit from some of those things that they're so just deeply embedded?
Yeah, like right now, just the meat causes XYZ disease, diabetes, cancer, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's. The kind of plant-based vegan world, I think, plays very fast and loose with the information. Yeah. Virtually all of the data that they cite are from these food frequency questionnaire studies where they will enroll people in the study and they ask them to, okay, not only did you need to report what you ate yesterday, go back 12 years and guesstimate what you were eating 12 years ago. And it's the information is garbage. Like there's more error than signal there. Like if we were trying to do some sort of a radio based around these principles, there's more error than signal there. You would never get anything, done with it, but it's very compelling. It kind of dovetails into a lot of the climate change discussion, which I did the book and film Sacred Cow, trying to look at the health, environmental, and ethical considerations of an animal inclusive food system. And it's really complex stuff. And it's from social media to mainstream media, political stuff, kind of social standing. Being more vegan centric it's a good place to be for business. It's a good place to be for social standing and hierarchy and all that type of stuff. And saying, no, I think actually grazing animals properly implemented could be favorable for the food system and also favorable for the environment. And you are a crazy person suggesting that. So I would say broad brushstrokes, just like the inclusion of animal products in general is probably the biggest bugaboo right now. Like people will say, well, it causes cancer, and you get in.
Well, they call it it's called a plant-based diet now. It's not called vegetarianism, and it feels to me like the marketing department got together and they said, guys, we can't call it global warming anymore. It's climate change.
Right.
And there's so much. And listen, I was a vegetarian for 10 years when I was young, and I was pudgy. It was very carb-centric, the diet. I was very low protein, carb-centric. It's very, very hard to eat nutritionally correct. And all protein is not equal. You look at the amino acid count of, say, beans versus beef, or you look at, the actual components in there.
Right.
And
right. It works for some, but it doesn't work for many. And it tends to work less and less well the older the person gets. This is one of the really interesting things that, circling back to your first question around the longevity topic, the more protein folks eat as they age, generally the better they do. And this is related to physical performance, maintenance of muscle mass, forestalling sarcopenia, that age-related loss of power generation and muscle mass. And so there's something interesting there that, on the one hand, we're being told that animal products and protein in general is this like toxic, horrible substance that we should eat the absolute bare minimum of. But then when we look at pretty well done longevity endpoints, the folks that are generally eating more protein tend to do better. And I'm not saying that in biology, there's usually some type of a trade-off somewhere in different stories, but I'm not suggesting that people need to become amateur bodybuilders to age effectively, but just doing a full body strength training routine 2 to 3 days a week, and then making sure that you get, about a gram of protein per pound of lean body mass is a great place to be. It seems really hard to improve on that. And I'm hard pressed to think about what you do from pharmaceuticals to stem cells to all this other stuff that's really going to be better than that. And even if you do all that other stuff, if you don't have that nutritional basis buttoned up, like you're just kind of peeing in the wind, it's not doing you all that much good.
So let's talk about Element a little bit here.
Sure.
So 2 years ago, Roy Dean said, hey, start getting ready for your black belt test. And being the OCD type, I did some deep dives into energy systems, into, training methodologies. And I put myself on this 6-month training program. I was rolling 5 nights a week. I was, doing my low intensity cardio sessions. I was doing my high intensity intervals. I was doing some high intensity continuous training. I was doing some strength training. And it was a lot. As you can imagine, it was a lot. And I was tracking everything. I was doing my HRV test every morning. I was tracking everything. And as you can imagine, recovery became a problem. For a guy in his 50s to be hammering twice a day, it became a problem. And I reached out to a friend of mine who's a strength and conditioning coach, kind of nutrition coach. And I said, hey, look at what I'm doing here and tell me how I can improve my recovery, because I'm having a little trouble here keeping this pace up. Even though I tried scaling it up, I started really slow and worked my way up. And he gave me some tips, some little advice here and there, some nutritional stuff. But then he said something that I hadn't considered before. He said, you need to be on electrolytes. You are at 7,000 feet. You are probably electrolyte deficient. Get yourself some electrolytes and do that. And so I did. I got my little squirt bottle with electrolyte fluid. I would put it in my water bottle. And it was like drinking ocean water. It was not flavored. It was just, and I would squeeze a lemon into my water bottles just to mask it a little bit.
Somewhat palatable, yeah.
Yeah, somewhat. And it made a difference. It definitely made a difference. It wasn't profound. It wasn't like all of a sudden I could double my volume or anything, but I just felt less depleted after those hard workouts. I felt like I was a little bit more recovered the next day. It just seemed to be helping. And I had never considered electrolytes before. And then, as I looked into it, it's like, oh, it's not just about your sodium intake. It's about your potassium intake. If your potassium is off, you can't assimilate enough sodium and that sort of thing. Well, fast forward, and I was pleasantly surprised that you launched a company that has a new product called Element, LMNT. It's the letters LMNT, a little play on words, Element. And these are little packets of electrolytes. And you were kind enough to send me a bunch of this stuff. There's a ton of flavors. And I assumed that this was going to be like drinking the ocean water with a little lemon that I had in the past. And I got it, opened one up, poured it in some water. In fact, I have a little right here. And it was delicious. I was like, this is like drinking a Gatorade. This is really good, surprisingly good. And in fact, what I've noticed now that I've been putting these packets in my water bottle when I go to Jiu Jitsu is I drink my entire bottle now. Like it used to be, I would come home with half a bottle of water. I wouldn't get through my entire. I'm finding that I'm hydrating better because it's so good. And now my biggest problem is I have to try to stop myself from putting one of these in every glass of water I drink because I'm finding them that's so delicious. So give me the story. How did this come about? I know that you had maybe a similar story in that you were finding yourself not as recovered. So walk me through how this came about.
And it's very sad when I look back, when I think about dabbling in jiu-jitsu, doing CrossFit and all this stuff. And I think years of just running really inadequate electrolytes, specifically sodium. But I've eaten a low-carb diet for about 22, going on 23 years, and that just works well for me. But in a low-carb environment, two things happen. I also eat pretty minimally processed foods. It's mainly like meat and vegetables, a little bit of fruit here and there. And there's not much sodium in that. And even if you salt that stuff, like you only add so much salt to a steak or a salad or what have you. And so when people do any type of a dietary shift towards less processed food, they tend to see their sodium decrease from an intake perspective. Another thing that tends to happen is when we eat less processed food, we tend to release less insulin. And when insulin levels drop, the hormone aldosterone decreases. And aldosterone is what causes us to retain sodium. It's one of the primary hormones that cause us to retain sodium. You stack into that some hard training, and like we've done some interesting work with folks in the NHL, which have been maybe the most adept at quantifying this stuff. They'll put sweat pads on their athletes so it can guesstimate what their total body water loss is. And these bigger dudes doing hockey in a 2-hour game or really hard training session, they'll lose 10 pounds of water and 10 grams of sodium. 10,000 milligrams of sodium.
So I will lose 5 pounds. I'll weigh myself after jiu-jitsu sometimes, and I'm literally 5 pounds of sweat.
Yeah. And so folks are losing a huge amount of water and sodium. And somewhere along the way, like if you look in the textbook of medical physiology, hydration means water plus electrolytes. But somewhere along the line, hydration became water. And this kind of got tied into like drink 8-ounce glasses of water a day, which there's just been some pushback against that stuff finally, that there's actually no science to support this. This just seemed like kind of a good idea. And it seemed like one of these, helpful things to recommend for folks to do. But it actually seems to be, one could make the argument that you would be, if you don't have access to electrolytes, either through the diet or supplemental like Element or drinking pickle juice or something, you'd be better off just not drinking so much water to keep your electrolytes more in balance than drinking a huge amount of water and diluting that sodium potassium ratio that's in our blood. And
that seems so counterintuitive because we've been so conditioned to drink.
Yeah. And maybe one of the best spots that people will notice this is if you've gone hiking and you're drinking like your Camel Pack and you're just kind of sipping on it throughout the process, and your hands start swelling and then your feet start swelling. And you end up with like this pitting edema where your socks leave lines in your skin and all this stuff. And that is a sign of hyponatremia, of low sodium levels. And usually people will think about, I need to eat more potassium. I need a banana. I need an avocado or something. Potassium is great. And most people don't get enough, mainly because they're eating processed foods. But it's mainly sodium that ends up being the limiting factor there. Like it's more dangerous to be under sodiumed than it really is under potassiumed. And there's some caveats to that. Again, if somebody's eating a really, really horrific diet, then the potassium becomes kind of more important. But it was talking to some folks who are coaches in this kind of low carb realm that I showed them what I was doing. And they're like, you look good, from a protein, carbs, fat perspective, but I think you're really under consuming sodium. And of course, what do you do when you have a world-renowned expert telling you to do something? You ignore it at first. You don't listen to them. And it took me about a year to listen to these guys, Tyler and Luis. They're the founders of an online boot camp called Keto Gains. They have a couple of 100,000 people that go through their program all the time, and their results are amazing. And I started noticing that they had some like low-carb Jiu Jitsu players going to Pan Ams and Mundials and all this stuff. I'm like, well, what are they doing? And they just make sure that these folks get both adequate protein, but also adequate electrolytes, specifically sodium. So once that problem was addressed for me, I was like, oh man, this is actually like really, really important. And we need to get this information out to as many people as we can. And we spun up a homebrew deal, which sounds very similar to what you were doing. It was like this much salt, this much no salt, which is potassium chloride, this much magnesium citrate, lemon juice, stevia, shake it up and go. And we called it Keto Aid. And in 6 months, we had probably 500,000 downloads of this thing. And people loved it, and it was really helping folks. But people started asking us, they're like, hey, could you do some sort of a convenience thing for this? Like when I travel and I go through TSA with 3 bags of white powder, like it's a rough day for me, I need something different than this. And so this was the whole impetus for developing Element. Like I've never really done a whey protein or a supplement or anything. Like I kind of look askance at most of that stuff, but I went back and revisited the electrolyte information, and other than pH, the most tightly regulated physiological processes in the body, it's pH first, arguably, and then electrolytes. If you show up in an emergency room unconscious, the 2 big things that they're looking at first, pH and electrolytes. And usually the first things they start addressing first, pH and electrolytes. So that's really the genesis of the company. And now, like we have Lance Armstrong is involved in recommending the product, and we're in 3 or 4 of the Navy SEAL teams. We're in all of the professional sports teams, and really pretty cool, in my opinion, is the adoption within police, military, and fire circles has been amazing. We, at the beginning of COVID, we learned that a number of people, both within hospital settings, but also, standard police and fire, these people were heat stroking out because they're wearing all this PPE and, it's super hot and confining and everything. And one of the big problems there is loss of sodium, specifically, electrolyte imbalances. So we gave away over 500,000 stick packs to frontline people. We were basically like, if you're a frontline worker, send us somewhere, tell us where to send you product and we'll send it. We didn't verify if they were really a frontline worker. We just, at the beginning of COVID, we didn't know how bad all this stuff was going to be, and we wanted to do whatever we could to help. And it was the best marketing campaign we've ever done, because everywhere we gave something away for free, people were like, oh, I love this. And then they ended up ordering it.
Yeah, I expected this to be like what I did before, and I opened the package and immediately was like, wow, this is actually really good.
Yeah. And we if there's any magic to Element at all, we have a solid formulation. It's convenient and it really tastes good. Like we really devote a lot of time to our flavor development, try to keep it as basic and natural as possible. We do have a raw, unflavored version because we use stevia as a sweetener. Some folks dislike stevia, and so for the people, there's no way to have one product that ticks all the boxes for everybody. So we have a raw, unflavored, which you would think would taste like, sweat rolling off of like a gorilla's back or something, but it actually tastes like kind of like Pellegrino, like it tastes like mineral water. So
I think the marketing writes itself there. Sweat off the back of a gorilla. Right. There's a product.
There's something waiting to happen there for sure. Yeah. But like this morning, I did a cup of coffee and I put a chocolate salt with just a splash of whole cream in here, and it ends up being like a chocolate salt mocha. And this is the way that I start most days now. And it's So I'm almost 50. I'll be 50 in like 6 months in January. And I try to play a very relaxed, non-athletic jiu-jitsu game. My strength and conditioning is to support my jiu-jitsu and just general health and longevity. So I don't go crazy really ever, but still, you know the drill. Like you've got a 215-pound, 3-stripe white belt who was a wrestler in high school. And even though you admonish them to be slow and relaxed, they're trying to take your head off. And we're used to, I would get in this kind of metabolic hole where after I trained, I'm like, oh my God, I need a nap and I don't think I can do anything else. And this was like, 8 years ago that I would do a hard jiu-jitsu session and I was ruined for the day. I'm 10 years older, but so long as I stay on point with the electrolytes, and I do a wide variety, like I do salami and olives and pickle juice and Element. Like if people don't want to buy Element, we still have the free downloadable Keto Aid guide, and we have all these like dietary sources for sodium. Our main gig is to just make people aware that they probably need more sodium, particularly if they're training hard. And like when they fix that, then magic happens. But it is interesting to me that although I'm very careful to not overtrain, the hard training that I do doesn't impact me the way that it used to. And if I'm feeling kind of off, I'll just keep, I'll mix up another element, or I'll do some pickles or some olives or something. And I kind of eat my way or consume my way back to normalcy by making sure that sodium is well addressed. And it's kind of cool that there was just a paper published recently that was suggesting that post-workout sodium loading dramatically improved recovery. There's a whole bunch of mechanisms. It suppresses cortisol release, so it gets you back down into that like parasympathetic state instead of releasing stress hormones. There's some kind of mechanistic characteristics there where sodium helps to shuttle nutrients into cells. And there's a bunch of other things that I don't think we fully understand. All very self-serving because I'm selling salt to people. But the cool thing is if somebody is feeling off and they try an Element, like 5 minutes later, or they just take a swig of pickle juice, like 5 minutes later, they're like, oh, I don't need another coffee. I just needed some electrolytes. And so it's been really cool in that it really seems to help people. Our main marketing plans is give away samples and then people like it, which I guess is the drug dealer deal. It's like first one's free and then you're selling your body on the street to get, to pay for your habit later. But it's been cool in that regard, in that we haven't needed to spin up some sort of like we don't have some mystical salt from, the backwoods of Nigeria or something that's mined in this unique source. It's like, no, it's just pure sodium chloride. And we make it, we do pure sodium chloride, so we know exactly how much sodium is in a stick pack and stuff like that because we want that consistency there. But it's been cool that it helps people, but we also don't need to like bomb people with a bunch of marketing BS. It's like, hey, just try it. If you don't like it, we'll send you your money back. And, so it's been really cool in that regard.
Well, and, my experience is the best products are born out of personal need. You're scratching your own itch and then other people want to jump on that bandwagon. Right. So it's good stuff. And my friend, you are doing good work. You have been doing good work for a long time. I don't know how many millions of people you have helped, but you're doing the Lord's work, my friend.
Hopefully I've helped more than I've damaged. So
probably, I think it's probably a good ratio at this point.
Yeah.
So where can people find you?
I have some social media accounts. I only write things up and send it to my assistant. I don't really go on social media much anymore. RobbWolf.com is kind of the main place to find everything I'm up to. Two B's? Two B's. RobbWolf. Anything worth doing once is worth doing twice. Do it right? Twice, yeah. And we do have an online community called The Healthy Rebellion. And that is the main place. Like if somebody wants to ask a question, can join that. Or my wife and I do a weekly Q&A podcast also called The Healthy Rebellion Radio. And those are kind of the main outlets that folks can get some interface with me. Fantastic. So, Robb, I'm so happy now that you're literally one state away from me. I know. So we're getting closer. Over time, we're getting closer. So I'm going to have to test out that brown belt. And you and I also have something else in common. We are both fans of margaritas, but we don't drink margaritas the way that
people think of as margaritas being this blended up, sugary, syrupy thing. When I order a margarita, I order an old school margarita the way you'd get in Mexico City in 1950, which is tequila, triple sec, and lime. And from what I understand, that's kind of your jam too.
Yep. And our truth be told, with Element, our first flavor was citrus salt, and we formulated it to be a margarita base. If the company failed as an electrolyte brand, we were going to pivot and be a drink company. So the citrus salt makes an amazing margarita base. It's phenomenal.
I've heard that people are doing that, and I got the grapefruit ones are really good. And I thought, man, I should blend some of this up and put a little, I'm having a UFC party on Saturday. Maybe I will give this a try.
The grapefruit makes a hell of a greyhound. So a little vodka in there, and it makes a heck of a greyhound. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Robb. It was awesome to reconnect with you, my friend. And we don't talk very often these days, but I know you've got my back and I've got your back, and I love what you're doing, my friend.
Thank you. And look forward to seeing you in real life here soon. We are close, but our states are large. So even though we're close, we're still a hefty drive away, but we'll fix that at some point.
At some point we will.
Yeah.
All right. Take care, Robb.
Take care, Rick.